Hello. Hello, Alex. Hello, Haley. Hello, Jacqueline. Ready to be read to? Grab a snack, your favorite beverage, your cats. Got a little Brigadoon music in the background today. Hello, Paige. Hello, Tyrell. Comments. A compliment to yesterday's video. Well, I don't mind accidental compliments. Or was it a compliment or a compliment? Alright, how are we doing for time here? 8:31. We'll give it about another minute and then we'll get started. Gives you some time to get snacks. Snuggle up in your favorite piece of seating, furniture. Compliment about my good hair. Oh, well, it's the cardigan. It makes my hair look better. It's also gotten past the point where it's just sort of foofy on the side, so it's getting a little more in control over here. All right. Exactly. All right. Why don't we get started? Reviewing from last session. Just to briefly catch you up, we left our hero Katrina in company of a fox and its wife and kids. They have just fed the princess who Katrina has made off with. She's basically been passed this baby and told good luck by the Queen's Fairy. We think it's the Queen's Fairy. And she's supposed to take care of her, and she's the only chance for the princess to survive the curse of Pernicia, the evil fairy. So, let's see how the rest of their journey goes. The baby's been fed because the mum fox kindly donated milk to the baby princess. Rather an unusual diet, but there we go. Chapter 5. There were fleas, but the wild garlic helped, and the reek of it kept certain other inevitable odors a little at bay. And she began to think that one or two of the fairy godmother's gifts that she had missed, while her hands were over her ears, must have been about good nature, because the princess was astonishingly good-natured during their long, difficult journey. The tantrum she had their first morning was the only tantrum she ever had. Maybe it's something in the milk, Catriona thought a little wildly, for the princess drank not only fox's milk, and goats and cows and ewes and mares and a variety of domestic cats and dogs, mostly sheepdogs and collies, but also does, badgers, otters, polecats, pine martens, wolves, lynx, wildcats, and bears. Some of these were more tactically difficult to achieve than others. She knew, although she had not been told, that some kind of word had gone out among the animals, that there was a baby walking west and north in the arms of a fairy woman, not her mother, who couldn't do much fairy work but could talk to animals. She hoped they said she was polite. And she often found when she huddled down by a farmyard at evening, or very early morning, one of the extraordinary adaptations the princess had made, without fuss, was to the necessary regime of only 2 meals a day, and asked, "Goat, goat, can you spare me any milk?" The goat, or whatever milking mother was on offer, was half expecting her, and could often tell her where to look for the princess' next meal as well. Catriona preferred the bigger farms. When she was lucky enough to find a farm that she thought she could risk approaching, hedgerow or haystack near the field, with the animals she wanted in it, farmhouse far from the farmyard, because the princess, especially since she only had the chance to slake it twice a day, had a mighty appetite, and a small householder would miss what she took. A few times Catriona left one of her last halfpennies on a doorstep, or tied up in the farmer's kerchief hung over his pitchfork, or by the sink in the dairy for the farmwife to find. This was the sort of thing that happened in this country, but then the halfpennies left were usually silver, or sometimes, if one was very lucky, something called fairy metal, although no one, including fairies, knew where it came from, iridescent in sunlight and strangely warm in the hand even in winter. Catriona's halfpennies were just the ordinary copper ones struck by the king's mint, but then you never got to spend the iridescent ones. They became family heirlooms, which was all very well after the day you had to go hungry because someone had pinched your milk. The story that went with the fairy metal coins was that the animals milked better, and the crops grew better, and the human farmer and farm family were healthier for the whole season after. She couldn't do anything about that either. All she could do was leave a plain, dull halfpenny. But often enough there was no farm, or there was a too populous village, too near even a good large spread-out farm, or something else was wrong. Often nothing Catriona could even describe, only a prickle between her shoulder blades that made her clutch the princess more closely and keep on. And then she had to listen for the sound of wild animals talking among themselves, which was as difficult as picking out a fox's red coat among last year's beech leaves, and for similar reasons. And then, having managed to orient herself to a sound not made by wind or water or will-o'-the-wisp, will-o'-the-wisps in that country could be quite noisy, if dancing lights and minor visions weren't alluring enough, and the wisps were beginning to feel frustrated. She had to try to move in that direction, till she could say, "Pardon me, gentle persons, I have a favour to ask," before they disappeared because a human was approaching them. Not always, even then, would they wait for her, but usually they did. The word had gone out. She wished she could ask why there had been that word. There weren't any stories that weren't obviously nursery tales about animals organizing to feed an orphaned baby. Did the animals know that this baby was the princess? Was that part of the word that was passed among them? No one had ever asked who the baby was, but then animals wouldn't. The baby was the baby, and the mother was the mother, even when she wasn't. The dog fox had been rude in suggesting the princess was not Catriona's baby, but foxes are brash creatures, and gratuitously inquisitive. Catriona couldn't imagine any animal but a fox, except possibly a few of the cheekier birds, remarking as he had remarked on the princess' name day. Animals always wanted to know. Their lives too often depended on it, but they rarely asked questions. You weren't supposed to have to ask questions. Language was a weak and unreliable means of taking in information, and many wild animals dispensed with it. Your ears and nose and eyes were much preferable. And because the animals did not question her, she could not ask them, "Why are you doing this for us?" There were stories that didn't sound like nursery tales, about companies of leopards and lynxes and dragons and wolves that had fought at the sides of various kings and queens many years ago. But maybe those were merely nursery tales for grown-ups. History was as unreliable as almost everything else that was influenced by magic in his country, which was nearly everything, and those stories could have been true, or they could have been not true. Did the animals know about Pernicia? But Catriona did not have to. But Catriona did have to go in search of animals to help her. They might expect her, they might wait for her, but they rarely came to meet her. She had had no warning one evening, and was beginning to feel some anxiety that she had gone so far into a plausible-looking wood without hearing enemy animal speech, when a hummock of darkness had risen in front of her in the twilight and shadows, and become a bear. She had gripped the princess so tightly she gave a little squeak and then began to cry, and even after the bear had addressed them in a voice as kind and loving as Catriona's aunt's, saying, "I have milk for your baby." It's my bear voice. Catriona had not been able to make any reply for at least a minute. The steady yellow eyes of wolves appearing out of the darkness between blink and blink was nothing compared to the revelation of the bear. The bear sat down quietly and crossed her immense dagger-clawed paws over her broad breast, and waited for Catriona to recover herself. Not wishing to appear rude, but still struck dumb, Catriona took a wavering step forward, and then the princess, who had stopped crying, gave one of her delicious crowing chirps, and held out her arms to the bear. There was this also to say about the bear. She was big enough, presumably, to spare milk for a human baby without much shortage to her own. It had taken most of a riverbank of otters to feed the princess another evening, although the otters had seemed to think it all a great joke. The nursing mothers had hung around talking among themselves about the adventure of feeding a human baby, while one after another had her turn with the princess, and before each had slid silently back into the river to return to her own territory and her own children. That had been a long night, because many of the otters were coming from a considerable distance, and the princess' dinner had a number of hiatuses, or perhaps merely courses, with which she put up with her usual good humor. The princess was undoubtedly thriving. She wasn't very clean, but she was bright-eyed and alarmingly cheerful, and apparently robustly healthy, and energetically putting on weight. Catriona's mind and eye noted this with satisfaction. Her back and shoulders were less pleased. It took them 3.5 months to return to Foggy Bottom. Catriona had decided that she had best travel mostly at night and off the main road, and with the increasing burden of the princess as well, she did not move very quickly. She began to feel as if the journey were her entire life, and that she would never come to the end of it. She felt that way particularly at the end of every night's walk, because she was always tired and hungry, and worried whether this would be the night when their luck ran out and she would find no milk for the princess. There was always a slightly dreamlike quality to talking to animals, both because it happened in your head, like you might make up imaginary conversations with people, and because the way animals' minds worked was so different from the way human minds worked. The disorienting quality of beast talking was that much more bewildering when you were tired. Hello friends, hello Katja, hello Sue, and hello Riley, I hope. Catriona was also always short on sleep because she woke often every day, thinking she heard the sound of pernicious creatures creeping near them. And what would they be? Dark and scaly with poisoned spines, slithery and slimy with too many legs, or more beautiful than anything that is kind and good, with eyes that killed you quicker than basilisks? Would it be worse if Catriona could talk to them too? Or maybe she didn't use creatures at all. Maybe Catriona would wake up drowning in a swamp, or having been turned into a giant hogweed or a troll. Or, worst thought of all, possibly Pernicia would come herself in person. Catriona often saw her, tall, deadly, swooping down to seize them both, or at least the king's hunters. Why hadn't the royal magicians found them? A really good magician could find anything that was lost by looking into the palm of the hand he usually carried his wand in. Even a not very good magician ought to be able to find something large and important and specific, like a baby princess, with a few drops of farseeing and a bowl of water. If the small person, the fairy who had given Katriona both the princess and a poem, was powerful enough to keep them invisible to the best searchers in the realm, why wasn't she powerful enough to protect the princess at home where she belonged? Or could the saber-bearer's amulet be hiding them? Katriona couldn't bear to think about any of it too closely. She often thought of trying to find a robin who could get a message to her aunt. Robins always seemed to have family in areas you wanted to get a message to or from, but she couldn't think of anything to say that wasn't more dangerous than remaining silent and continuing to trust to luck. It was bad enough she was leaving a trail of stolen milk between the royal city and the gig. Perhaps their luck was merely that magicians scorned talking to animals. Animal thoughts weren't nearly orderly enough to suit magicians, and they were always full of large, untidy preoccupations, like sex and death and the next meal. She had seen no one in the royal livery in weeks. She often had to follow the main road for a little while, because it was the only way through, and sometimes they had to sleep near it because she was too tired to look for better shelter. And then she would be awakened by the sound that travellers made, and peer through leaves or shrubbery to see them, half hoping she would overhear some conversation about the missing princess, about the 10-foot giant who had snatched her out of her cradle at the name day, and had been seen striding south with her, which was where the king's trackers were concentrating their efforts. She hoped it was a good thing to see no one in the king's livery. She was always hungry. She was often too tired to forage for herself properly after she'd found milk for the princess, and she was desperately weary of the sort of things you could scrounge in Wildland in summer and eat raw. Only a few times, when it had been raining and they were both wet and cold, did she risk a fire. One of her aunt's charms persuaded Wetword to burn, although the wetter the wood, the sooner the charm wore out. Her aunt sold many of these charms in the Fenny gig, and then only if she could find a place far enough from the road and with the wind in the right direction. Once or twice the halfpennies she left in dairies were for cheeses she'd stolen, but the only milk she was willing to drink was goats and cows and ewes, although it was sometimes offered elsewhere, including by the bear. She was tired of sitting on the ground, and even with the no-rocks charm, there was an infinity of difference between sleeping on the ground and on the oldest, roughest, lumpiest, and most in need of restuffing mattress made by human hands, and sheltered by 4 walls and a roof, and furnished with blankets and pillows. They never slept in trees. Katrina did not want to find out the hard way that that particular charm would not include a baby she carried. She was also, of course, very, very tired of the princess. But the first time she had leant over her to pick her up for their evening's walk, seen her eyes focus gravely on the face above her, and then, after a thoughtful moment, watched her face break out into a smile as bright as daylight, a smile just for her, Katriona, as clear as if the princess had called her by name. She had to admit she was also rather terrifyingly fond of her, even if she did weigh too much, and always needed changing. I didn't have to rush up to the cradle and start babbling to her like a loony, Katriona thought testily. Nobody forced me, I just did. But if I hadn't, who would have her now? The small fairy would have found someone else, wouldn't she? She would have found someone better, wouldn't she? What had she told the poor king and queen? The last thing before Katriona fell asleep every morning, she recited to herself the verse the small fairy had taught her. She often fell asleep murmuring, "Weave your grey web nearer," and woke up murmuring, "Lost, lost, lost is the wearer." "Your golden crown is certainly lost," she said under her breath one evening, dunking the grubby baby in a shallow pond, fairly warm after the sun had been on it all afternoon. The grubby baby laughed and pulled up a handful of bottom-of-shallow-pond mud and decomposing slime and rubbed it into her hair. This was excellent fun, so she pulled up another. "Oh, you're a lot of help, you are," said Katriona, making a dive at her with a reasonably clean piece of flannel and rubbing her face. The princess put up with his indignities stoically. "Sometimes I think I miss soap even more than bread. But you know we'll be home soon." She paused, and the baby, catching her mood, also paused and looked at her anxiously. "Home for you too," Katriona said. catching one of the muddy hands and applying her flannel to it. "Home for you, too." It rained steadily the last day and a half to Foggy Bottom. Katrina used the weather as an excuse not to stop either. She had run out of halfpennies a se'nnight ago, despite how frugally she had hoarded them, and was hungrier than ever. And she was too tired to do anything but stay on the main cart track into the gig when the dawn came. It had been empty all night, and she managed to get off the road before any of the other occasional travellers saw her during the day. Her aunt would know how to tell everyone that Katrina had come back from the princess name day with a baby of a suspicious age. She assumed that the news of the princess' disappearance would have flown round the country as quickly as the news of her birth had. Although, could anyone entertain so ludicrous a notion that someone like Katrina had successfully kidnapped the princess? If the princess had disappeared on account of the threat from Pernicia, it was because she had been hurried off to some royal stronghold where the most powerful magicians, the wisest fairies, the cleverest scouts, and sharpest troops could keep her safe. When Katrina felt she couldn't walk any farther, she stopped and sat down under a tree for a few minutes, and leaned against it, and fell into a kind of semi-conscious drowse. And as soon as she could struggle to her feet again, she did so. The princess, for the first time, was not feeling well and wasn't hungry, but was restless and whimpery, and Katrina was therefore even more anxious to get her home to her aunt. "Oh, aunt," she thought, "you won't believe how much I have to tell you." The rain and wind among the leaves made enough of a din on the second evening that she couldn't hear her own footsteps, although she could feel the mud sucking at her feet, trying to pull her shoes off, trying to unbalance her till she fell down. She often stumbled. She kept the edge of her cloak pulled over the feverish baby, for it was wool, and warm even as wet as it was. But being wool, it also became heavier and heavier as it grew wetter and wetter. Katrina sneezed. "It's summer," she thought drearily. "I shouldn't have a head cold in high summer." She knew all the back ways in and out of Foggy Bottom, but she was too tired to choose. She took the first turning off the main road that would lead her to her aunt's house, to her house. If she met anyone she knew, she didn't know what she would say with the baby in her arms. She didn't know, and she was too tired to care. She was home at last. She was nearly home at last. Her aunt had the door open and was looking out. "Oh, Katrina," she breathed, and embraced her before she was over the threshold, in spite of the rain and the baby. She made room for the baby in her hug, as she might have made room for any other impediment. Katrina sneezed again. "I'll give you something for that," said her aunt, and pulled her filthy wet cloak off her, and drew her to the fire, and Katrina felt the fingers at the back of her neck untying the ragged scarf that had valiantly withstood its unsuitable occupation as baby sling for so long, and still her aunt asked no question and made no exclamation. As the sling came loose and Katrina settled the princess in her lap in the way she had settled her in her lap any number of times over the last 3.5 months. "But in a chair," said a small internal voice, refusing to be daunted by head colds and exhaustion. "In a chair. In a chair you will be able to sit in again tomorrow, and the day after that." She reached up and grasped her aunt's hand. Her aunt was occupied drawing the little table and another chair to the fire. "Aunt," said Katrina, and her voice shook a little. "Aunt, this is the princess. They gave her to me." And then all the last 3.5 months rose up together and fell on her, and she put her free arm on the table and leaned her head against it, and cried and cried and cried and cried. And she only stopped at last because the princess started crying too. When Katrina had reassured her, and the princess had fallen into a heavy doze, drooling fondly down Katrina's neck, Katrina told her aunt everything she could remember about the name day, about Pernicia, about the small, drably dressed fairy, and the verse she had taught her, about the king and queen, about the saber-bearer and his amulet, about the gold and white and lavender streamers with the pink and white rosettes, which were still, ruinously wrinkled, in the bottom of one of her pockets, and how she hadn't been able to bear to throw them away. and about how it was that while Catriona had often gone hungry, the princess had always had her milk. Her aunt listened to everything, occasionally patting Catriona's hand, and apparently not noticing the increasing reek of wet, unwashed person and wet, unwashed baby that rose from Catriona and the princess, as the fire warmed them and the rain came off them as steam. Catriona was still talking hoarsely when she fell asleep. When she woke up, she was both clean and in bed, in her bed, in any bed. For a moment she thought she had dreamed, and she struggled not to wake up. No, she felt her way down to the foot of her bed and looked over the rim of the loft and saw the cradle by the fire. There had never been a cradle by the fire since Catriona could remember, and she could see her aunt's foot rocking it gently. Most of her aunt was hidden behind the back of her chair, but she must have heard her niece stir. Just refilling my water here. Because she put her head round the chair and saw her sitting up and looking down. "How are you feeling?" said her aunt. "Good," said Catriona, after a moment in surprise. "Better than I've felt since the name day. Aunt, I've had a bath." Her aunt smiled. "Only as much as I could arrange. You can have a proper bath later. Or there's only so much you can do with an unconscious, snoring body, even with cooperative water. And I had to save some of my energy for persuading the ladder to carry you up to the loft. But I thought you'd be more comfortable, clean, and in your own bed. How's the cold?" "Gone, I think." She stood up waveringly. "I'm so hungry I can't think." "Don't think," said her aunt. "Eat. We'll think together later." There was bread and chutney and a salad of greens and new potatoes on the table, and Catriona ate it all. Only then did she approach the cradle. She knelt beside it. The princess, also looking very clean, was asleep. For the first time Catriona really noticed that her hair was blonde and curly, her skin pale but rosy, and she looked lovingly at the long silken eyelashes lying sweetly against the little satin cheek. "Aunt," she said softly, "I don't even know what to call her. Her names, Casta, Albinia, Allegra, Dove, Minerva, Fidelia, Aletta, Blythe, Domnia, Delicia, Aurelia, Grace, Isabel, Griselda, Gwyneth, Pearl, Ruby, Coral, Lily, Iris, Briar, Rose. I've been calling her Baby, or, when we were far enough from everyone, Princess, because I didn't want her to forget. I know that's silly when she's only a baby, but... And besides, you can't call a princess by name, can you?" "Briar Rose," said her aunt. "Rose. Rosie. Rosie is a good name for a little village maiden. We'll call her Rosie." And that is the end of part 1 and chapter 5. I'm going to check how we're doing for time. Perfect. We have oodles of time. We have time for another chapter. Let's see. So far, so good. Chapter 6, beginning of part 2. The next time a royal herald appeared in Foggy Bottom, shortly after the arrival of Aunt's second niece, Rosie, it was a far more subdued and apprehensive occasion. The villages of the gig had heard of the events of the Princess' Name Day from the returning attendees. Fortunately, no one asked Catriona why it had taken her better than twice as long to make the journey home as it had the journey away, and had looked at their spinning wheels and hand spindles in alarm and dismay. Every home in the gig had at least one tool for spinning. The weavers in Smoke River paid real coin for good thread, and Lord Prendergast, as well as most of the local smallholders, raised sheep. The herald brought instructions that no spindle, iron or wood, should have a point on it thinner than the forefinger of a 3-month-old baby, which had been the age of the princess on her name day, and the herald here brandished a wooden peg that looked unsettlingly like a baby's forefinger. Catriona shivered, and needlessly rearranged the contentedly sleeping princess in her new baby sling. The princess gave a little moan of objection and lapsed back into unconsciousness. Aunt had firmly said that the entire village was ordered to attend the herald's announcement, and that the entire village had to be there, including Catriona and Rosie. I'll carry her if you wish, but be there you both must be." She looked into Catriona's drawn, unhappy face and said, "My dear, think about it. No sane grown-up would leave a baby home alone, and the one thing we absolutely cannot do is call attention to ourselves by staying away. There is nothing about Rosie to suggest she is anything but our Rosie." Catriona took comfort in the presence of several other women clutching babies of various ages and looking frightened, and in the reassuringly large and solid proximity of Barter, who had worked his way through the crowd to stand next to her for the herald's proclamation. This herald, too, was gone the next day, but there was no celebration in the pub the previous evening. The herald had brought other news, that the king and queen were offering a fantastic reward for any news of Pernicia, of her whereabouts, her situation, her plans, her powers, anything, any news at all. Squadrons of the king's armies and parties of the king's magicians were still scouring the countryside for any trace of her, but so far as the herald and Aunts Robins knew, they had found nothing. Nor had anyone else. No one had come forward to claim a portion of the king's reward. No one was able to say anything about where she had been before the name day, nor where she was and what she was doing now. No one. Not one of all the court fairies and magicians, who were among the most powerful in that country. Not one of the magisterial seniors at the academy. Not one of the dangerously wayward fairies of the Wildlands, who could see through stone and talk to fireworms, and hear the stars singing. Pernicia, the people murmured. Wasn't that the name of... There were tales that people's grandparents and great-grandparents had told them, that they had had from their grandparents and great-grandparents. The story was of a wicked fairy with a name like Pernicia, who had sworn revenge on the queen of their country many generations ago, a queen who had been unusually clear-sighted and unshakable by any magical means, even for a queen. Pernicia, if that had been her name, had said to her, "It is true, you have defeated me for now, but one day I will throw your heirs' down, and shatter your country with the shock, till no stone stands on any other stone that human hands set together, and the animals flee underground to the deepest roots of the mountains, and the birds will not sit in the trees, and the trees themselves bear no leaves and no fruit." And the wicked fairy, whose name might have been something like Pernicia, went away into some wilderness where no one could find her, for she set magical guardians around it, so that the wilderness appeared even wilder than it was, and people stayed away without knowing why they stayed away. And, the story said, she set herself to learning how to live past the usual span of human years, so that she might have her revenge in the time that suited her best, and that she should be there in the full strength of her pride and malice to enjoy it. Perhaps she was powerful enough and wicked enough to have learnt it, for it was said that if you were powerful enough and wicked enough, there was a way. But that country was full of magical wildernesses where no one went, and even if you did go there, even if you were a very clever fairy or a very wise magician, you were very unlikely to see or to find everything that was there. And that country was full of tales of fairies and magicians and magic. Many of them were just tales. But Catriona remembered the small fairy saying to her, "Oh yes, I know who she is, but I did not know she was so powerful. I hoped, as one always does, and hope until catastrophe strikes, that it would not come. I hoped that the years had worn her out, the years since our last queen." If the tale about a wicked fairy with a name like Pernicia was more than just a tale, and if that Pernicia had returned from her long exile, then the country was in the gravest danger it had been in since the plague of fireworms had set upon it from the north. Pernicia had nearly defeated the queen she had faced long ago, and if the queen had been merely an ordinary queen, she would have defeated her. And if Pernicia had learnt the secret of long life, she would have spent the years while she waited for her opportunity, learning new wickedness and nursing her hatred. King Harold had thrown the fireworms back, but the gig's terrain still showed the scars of the conflict in high tors and sudden valleys where the battles had been fought. And the fireworms had melted the landscape in fury when the magician-wrought armour of Harold's regiments withstood them. What might Pernicia do that would batter and buckle the entire country? The princess must be kept safe, not only for her own sake, but for the sake of the country. Even the king's conniving cousins, who had gone home in disgust upon the birth of the princess, showed no signs of wishing to return to the court now that she had disappeared. The princess yet lived. Pernicia's own disappearance proved that. But the princess must be kept safe, wherever the king and queen had her hidden. The heralds had no news about that, but then the people did not expect it. It was not a thing to speak aloud with Pernicia listening. Everyone all over the country went home after hearing the herald's announcement, and at once knocked the pointed ends off their spindles and threw them on the fire, or bashed them with mallets and gave them to their local smiths, who threw them on the hotter smithy fires. Then they looked sadly at the mutilated spindles. Weavers temporarily found their thread supplies short, while spinners adapted to shorter and thicker spindles. Later on, spinners and tool makers began to develop new spindles, and new ways to cast their thread on and off them. Over time, in a mixture of anger and fear and resentment, and a fuzzy but sincere desire to show support for their royal family, a new art form was born, spindle ends. At first, these were only rough shapings of the beheaded ends, merely to make them look less wrong. Spindles became readily detachable from wheels and handles, so that one shape or another could be tried and fiddled with and remade and tried again. Iron spindles was discarded altogether. Spindles and spindle ends became objects interesting in their own right. People argued as passionately over which woods made the best spindle ends as they did over which made the best bows and hafts. Over more time and obstinacy, the new spindle ends became not merely necessary adaptations of an old system, but the way things were, and the offhand whittling of them became both elaborate and beautiful. A spindle was now a rounded, palm-sized end, tapering to a slim, graceful rod, no thinner than a 3-month-old baby's forefinger. Little loops began to appear on spindle posts, where out-of-use spindles were dropped point down. Doorways and chimney pieces sprouted similar loops for hand spindles. Spinners grew much more organized about finishing off, so that their spindle ends were free for display when not in active use. The broad, blunt ends of wheel spindles, in particular, were intricately carved. Eventually, in later generations, a hand-carved spindle end was a favorite wedding gift, believed to confer good luck and healthy children on the bride and groom, and especially fine examples of the spindle carving art were highly prized heirlooms. In neighboring countries, people who saw the spindle ends that people of this country began carrying with them for luck adapted their own spinning wheels so that they too could use their neighbors' beautiful spindle ends. And spindle ends became one of this country's most sought-after exports. No one outside seemed able to learn the knack, although many tried. But in areas that had never seen a carved spindle end, they still picked up the phrase, used of someone or something the speaker treasured, "Sound is a good spindle's end." But that was much later. While Aunt threw her spindle point into the fire and prodded it into the heart of the flames, Katrina took off the amulet she was still wearing hidden under her clothing, and held it between her two hands. The disturbed fire flared up, and the hot red light fell across the amulet, and it flared too, and Katrina almost dropped it, as if it were a chain of embers and would burn her. She remembered the sense of it pulsing between her fingers on the princess' name day. It had lain quietly since then till this moment. The fire-colored light flickered in the same rhythm as the vibration against her fingers, and the amulet sparkled along its whole length, even where the shadow of her fingers fell across it. "I think," she said slowly, "I think I will not wear you any more." She raised her head and saw Aunt looking at her, the poker still in her hand. "I'll give you something to wrap it in," said Aunt, and Katrina knew she meant something that would disguise it from magic-seeing eyes. There was a little iron cup that stood on its own 3 legs, like a miniature cauldron, in a niche high in the stone chimney. It had held other small magics safe from prying eyes, but it was empty now. Katrina pulled a stool in front of the hearth and stood on it so she could reach the niche and the cup. The cloth Aunt handed her was white, and when Katrina laid the amulet on it, she half expected the whiteness to blacken and char. But it did not. She folded the cloth round it carefully, and curled her thin package twice around the inside of the cup till it lay flat. "Should I lid it with iron too?" asked Katrina. Aunt thought. "No," she said after a moment, "I don't think there'll be enough leak to notice. Not in this house. Let the poor thing breathe. Something like that. Likely it'll be happier if it can keep its eye on us, too." "On Rosie," said Katrina. The local chief priest came calling to inquire self-importantly about Rosie's name day and dedication. Aunt was ready for him, and polite to him, neither of which was true of Katrina, till Aunt sent her on an imaginary errand to rid herself of the distracting series of muffled objections, which were Katrina's only contribution to the conversation, stiff as it was already. Part of the vehemence of her feeling was based on the fact that the gig's chief priest was a pompous ass. The gig was too obscure to have its own bishop, although the sleekest and most worldly-wise priest, of which the chief priest of the gig was neither, was never perfectly at ease with the meekest and least active professional fairy, of which Aunt was neither. It was not an easy vocation, being a priest in that country, where magic was vibrantly everywhere, maddening and unquenchable, and the gods were assumed to be a kind of super-fairy, except that you never saw them, nor were offered any concrete proof of what the priests claimed they had done for you. Possibly because of the rampaging dailiness of the magic of that country, its natives could rarely be persuaded to spend any serious time or thought on questions of how the world began, or what it was for, or why people were people instead of stick insects or pondweed, or any of the other standard varieties of religious inquiry. For the ethics restraining you from bashing your neighbor and stealing his land or his money or his daughter, there were centuries of instilled belief that these were bad things to do, and a strong government that, for many centuries, had agreed. And for ecstatic visions, there was the illegal eating of fish. Aunt's theories about priests was that religion had emigrated from some other, less magical country, and its missionaries, while of good, stout, disbeliever-thumping stock, had never really adapted to the peculiar conditions of this country, and therefore, while they had managed to rig a sort of clumsy administrative scaffolding, it had never, so to speak, had its walls and roof put on, and developed a vernacular architecture. The priests had gained some ground over the generations, with certain cabals of magicians, but priests and fairies remained like oil and water. Katrina returned from her errand to find Aunt alone, amusing Rosie by swinging on its thin coloured string the tiny god charm the priest had blessed her with. Rosie sat on the floor and made snatches at it, falling over at intervals. "Fairy godparents might have been quite a good notion towards a truce between us," Aunt said thoughtfully. "It's a pity the possible precedent was such a disaster." "He just wants the money," Katrina said, outraged that Aunt had agreed to a second abbreviated name day for Rosie, as if her first one had not been more than enough for anyone. Aunt sighed. The priest was not a pleasant companion, and talking to him had given her a headache. "Yes, of course he does, but he'll use it to buy food and firewood for those who need it. Don't worry, I've already explained that my sister had Rosie dedicated before she died. She won't have the words spoken over her again." You wanted to be careful about the super fairies, just in case their magic was anything like the usual stuff, where doing the same spell twice could cause serious havoc. But I couldn't afford to insist against it. What if he tried to trace my supposed sister's supposed priest to make sure the ceremony was done? Priests have more contacts than robins. Katrina subsided, but with an ill grace. Foggy Bottom's priestling earned his title, and a certain grudging respect even from Katrina, by nursing the sick and the indigent, but he was afraid of Aunt, as if religion and magic might ricochet off each other to the harm of innocent bystanders. While he was ready to do his duty by all his parishioners, even to the extent of rubbing the dedication herbs and oils into the potentially combustible foreheads of babies related to Aunt by blood. He was certainly not going to go out of his way to pursue her about it. After his chief's visit, he was only too visibly relieved to be let off the actual rite, and accepted the promised fee for adding Rosie to Foggy Bottom's church registry with a hand that shook only a little. Rosie, who had to be present for this transaction, smiled at him benevolently, and would have pulled his priest's plate, except that he flicked it out of her way in time, and proffered the string of his hood as a substitute. She pulled with glee, and made happy little chirps at each tug. "She sounds like one of your robins," said the priest, thinking that she was a difficult baby not to like, whomever she might be really related to. "Not when she wants something and thinks it's not coming fast enough," said Aunt dryly. Rosie grew up square and strong and stubborn and inquisitive, with a limitness of both energy and persistence that meant she was a great trial to Aunt and Katrina while she was still young enough to require constant watching. "Mind you," said Aunt, "little children are like this." Aunt was the eldest of 11 and spoke from long experience, "but I've never seen one that was Rosie's equal for sheer pig-headedness, with all due respect to pigs." Katrina sighed. She wanted children of her own, even if it turned out that Aunt was right and she was wrong, and she was a real fairy herself. But the experience of raising Rosie was making her feel that perhaps she wanted fewer than she had previously imagined. Even when Aunt had 1 or 2 small boarders to stay, as she often did, till their baby magic ran its course and they were safe to return to their families, Rosie was deflected from her purposes not a whit by prognosticating furniture, clothing that giggled and ran away when you tried to put it on, nor a ravening panther just outside the door, apparently waiting to swallow the first person it saw. It was something like a panther. Manifestations of baby magic are only as good as the imagination of the child, and this one's understanding of natural history was not so great as his desire for mayhem. This was convenient in one way, as a more nervous and dependent child would have been made miserable by baby magic jokes and ruses, but Katrina sometimes thought it might have been worth it. Katrina had been officially sworn and contracted as Aunt's apprentice shortly after Rosie had come to live with them, which in theory meant that Katrina could be sent instead of Aunt to attend to any fairy task Aunt thought her capable of. But in fact, Katrina found learning basic fairycraft something of a struggle, despite her zealous dedication. At first, the only clear manifestation of her aptitude for any magic at all was her ability to throw, so to speak, cold water on the various conflagrations of baby magic, and there was no plan or subtlety to that. It was just a reflex, like grabbing the milk jug before Rosie knocked it over, or a boarder turned it into a wasp nest. The early years of her apprenticeship felt like a kind of frantic juggling act, and the only real difference between handling magic and handling Rosie, she thought despairingly, was that there was no malice in Rosie. Rosie hated her curly golden hair. When she was old enough to hold minimal conversations, the itsy-bitsy cutesy-coo sort of grown-ups would pull the soft ringlets gently and tell her what a pretty little girl she was. She would stare at this sort of grown-up and say, "I am not pretty. I am intelligent and brave." The grown-ups usually thought this was darling, which only made her angry, perhaps partly because she was speaking the truth, although it was tricky to differentiate between brave and foolhardy at 3 or 4 years old. Fortunately, her faith in grown-ups other than Aunt and Katrina was founded on people like Barter. Barter had a ritual of picking her up, saying, "Oof," followed by, "So, you're a strapping lass. Are you going to grow up to be a blacksmith like Gnarl, or a wheelwright like me?" and tossing her in the air. She adored Barter from the beginning, and was magnanimous about the fact that as the years passed he threw her less and less high. But aside from her hair, she was not pretty. All those fairy godmothers giving her lips like cherries and teeth like pearls and skin like silk, and they forgot to make her pretty, thought Katrina. And she was intelligent. She was intelligent enough, for example, to grasp that Aunt's prized scissors, the only pair in the village, were a much more precise cutting tool than a knife, neither of which, in theory, she was allowed access to. She nonetheless came indoors for tea one day, with her hair lopped off to about half a hand's breadth all over her head. It stood out like the corolla of a ragged sunflower. Aunt and Katrina were initially so stunned that Rosie had time to put the scissors carefully back where they belonged, with an easy familiarity that proved she'd done it often before. But the uproar this caused was nothing compared with the uproar when Katrina noticed she had also cut her eyelashes. Various negotiations, including finally such desperate measures as, "Supposing you ever want to eat again," eventually produced the grudging promise that, in return for Katrina keeping her hair cut short, she would leave her eyelashes alone. Short hair rather suited Rosie. The bones of her square little face stood out with a clarity that seemed to reflect, or warn of, her personality. And without the distracting curls, Katrina found herself noticing more often the expressions flashing over that small candid face. When she was watching Rosie with only half her attention, she was often startled into full heed by a turn of Rosie's head, a look in her eye, a tip of her chin, underscored perhaps by a gesture of her hand, a drop of one shoulder, a playful leap, and Katrina was reminded briefly but intensely of a fox, a badger, a wildcat, a doe. Not any fox or badger or wildcat or doe. Rosie had a humorous, wily, shrewd look Katrina remembered from a particularly kind and clever nanny goat they had met on their journey, and an earnest, ardent look that came from a sheepdog. Even Rosie's curious ability to mimic Aunt's robins, to the extent that the robins themselves went off into gales of good-natured robin laughter about the nearness of her near misses, began to seem a little ominous. What, thought Katrina, did our princess drink in with the milk? She refused to think about what she had said over the cradle during the wreck of the name day. "You can have my gift. It isn't very useful. I can talk to animals." She had only been speaking to say something, to drive away the sound of the words Pernicia had spoken. What she said hadn't meant anything, any more than any words she or anyone else might have said could have driven off Pernicia's curse. She mentioned the question of the milk quietly to Aunt one evening, and Aunt looked at Rosie for a while, her fingers and foot on the treadle, continuing unfalteringly their business of spinning. Rosie was trying to feed her unwanted supper porridge to the left-hand fire dog, which was her favourite. Katrina herself couldn't see the difference, but knowing Gnarl, who had made the pair, there was one. Both bore hound faces, with flying back ears lying along their necks, as from a rush of wind, and open-mouthed, eager expressions. Rosie was murmuring to her friend. The only clear phrase often repeated was, "It's good for you." Katrina, watching, saw the dog aspect of Rosie more clearly than usual in the moving fire shadows. There was that sheepdog, but there had also been other sheepdogs. There had also been that gaunt, intense, solemn hound, not unlike what must have been in Gnarl's mind when he made the fire dogs, and a large, slow, thoughtful, heavy-coated dog, rather like a small bear. "I can't see it," said Aunt later when Rosie was in bed, "which is not to say it isn't there. I don't know, my dear. She's happy, she's healthy, she's growing. She is certainly growing, and we love her." Katrina could hear the tiny waver in Aunt's voice as she said, "We love her," because they did, and she was the princess. "Small spider weave," thought Katrina, "and a poem is the most I can give her, my dear, my only darling. When will she send word?" "It will have to be enough," said Aunt. Mostly it was enough, except for the dreams when an assortment of terrifyingly grand or villainous-looking persons turned up on their threshold, quoting the rhyme and demanding the princess return. Katrina was grateful that Rosie got into life so enthusiastically. This made her seem, to Katrina, like a real member of the village. But then, what did Katrina know of princesses? Maybe they were all like real members of villages, except that they were princesses. That was the year Rosie was 4. It was a few weeks after Rosie cut her hair that something more disturbing happened. That is the end of chapter 6, and we are basically out of time, so I'm going to end it there. we will start with chapter 7 tomorrow. Thank you once again for tuning in, my friends. I do like reading with you. It's such a good book that I am tremendously tempted to pick it up and reread it myself. But I want to go through it with you at the same pace. So I'm restraining that urge. So have a wonderful night. As always, you are welcome. I'm glad that so many of you seem to be enjoying this and finding it a source of comfort. If you have any questions, as usual, questions, feedback, comments, send them to me over Instagram or message me on Facebook, that kind of thing. I do like to hear comments and feedback, whether it's positive or other, and I do my best to take it into account. Bonsoir. Bonsoir as well. Have a wonderful night, friends. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you tomorrow.